So, about a year ago, this little known indie publisher called Sony released a game called Horizon Zero Dawn to pretty much overall critical acclaim. And I know you're already thinking from the title, yeah, I'm comparing Horizon to Far Cry, The Witcher and even Zelda, and that's a bit unfair, because Horizon is a good game on its own, but it's also a game heavily inspired by those games I just mentioned. Well, at least two of those games. The third one is more of a what could have been scenario I made up. So without further ado, let's start this comparison. Crafting systems have become somewhat looked down upon by gamers because of their sometimes poor implementation and a lot of times lack of meaningful reward for it. By that I mean the things you receive from crafting, and in this department both Far Cry and Horizon fail. I want to put a little explanation here on why I'm only comparing the Horizon and Far Cry, and that's because they have extremely similar crafting systems, while The Witcher and even Zelda, which I said I wasn't gonna compare, have a lot more complicated systems, so I didn't feel like it was worth comparing crafting systems here for the purpose of the video anyway. Both games have crafting systems that only serve mostly to make weapons or expand inventory or, making ammunition and potions, which I'll be honest, aside from health potions, potions in these games have a tendency to be rather useless, or at least forced in. The uselessness of these crafting mechanics is only accentuated by how easy the games are, or by the fact that a lot of the crafting items can just be bought at vendors.
Got something that might interest you.
In this category, I have a hard time telling which one of these is best, or I guess worst, because of how you go about getting crafting materials. While Horizon has the bigger animals, but a lot of those hunts, especially with bigger robots, end up being rather hyper-specific, since a lot of their drops only serve to craft one specific, non-expendable item, as in an item that doesn't break, which takes away from wanting to go and fight whatever monster you fought a second time. Monster, robot, whatever. This will also happen in Far Cry, but it takes much longer since you'll have to kill animals multiple times. This also happens in Horizon to a certain degree, but that's with smaller animals. And since smaller animals aren't indicated in the map of Horizon, it becomes a lot more of a random thing rather than a hunt thing. Horizon has a lot more RNG than Far Cry, and this is where Far Cry has a very clear advantage over Horizon, since Far Cry's hunt outcome will depend mostly on the weapon you use. Obviously, this is a lot easier for Far Cry, since it has a much larger weapon selection, which brings us to another strong suit and also drawback of Horizon, as it only has a handful of weapons, and this choice was obviously made to have a system focused on elemental attacks. And while that's really cool, when you're fighting really big robot dinosaurs, well, the other 80% of the game doesn't really use them that much, and that lack of weapon variety becomes very apparent and somewhat boring when doing things like securing a campsite. Which brings us to a next point of comparison. Campsite is where Far Cry just destroys Horizon. There's a fairly obvious reason for this, because this is the main focus of Far Cry, while Horizon felt a lot more like it was just shoved in. There isn't even that many campsites in the game. And now you're probably saying exactly what I just said, that's not the point of Horizon. And you're probably saying that the point of Horizon is the hunts, which is true. But that's kind of the point of this video, to show that you can't just put pieces of game design just because they somewhat fit thematically, which is something a lot of modern games are guilty of doing. But getting back to the comparison, well, one of the points we already mentioned with the weapon variety, and that obviously limits how you can approach each situation. But to me, one of the biggest sins Horizon does is level design. In Far Cry, the campsites are usually square, as in they're full of squares, and they're usually square shaped, which creates a very easy way to tell if you're in or out of cover, and it becomes a lot easier to also travel around the campsite stealthily. Not only that, but the campsites can also be approached from pretty much every angle, as they're very open. Now Horizon is super limited. For starters, there are no angles without kinda bugging out the game. You can only enter campsites from very specific entries, And the campsites themselves are usually round and filled with small or thin objects carried around, and that all adds up to create a fairly annoying stealth experience. And the non-stealth option is also made worse by this level design as well, since the lack of entrances and path becomes a lot harder for the enemy NPCs to do anything besides run directly at you, like in a corridor shooter, for example, which isn't very fun. Also, Horizon just feels like it isn't using all of its cards here. As most of single-player games published by Sony this generation, there's a certain level of parkour and this feature that could have been easily made to make campsites, well, fun, but parkour in Horizon seems to be mostly used for very linear and vertical levels. You know, like it was forced in or something. As in, parkour in Horizon usually, if a place can be accessed by parkour, it probably cannot be accessed in any other way. Okay, now I want to talk about the infamous towers. Everyone knows the towers in Far Cry games, Horizon games, and honestly, I don't have much to say about the towers. Both are kinda boring and they both serve the same purpose, but while one does try to throw a few difference between each tower, not that much difference, but still, you know, something to try and throw you off or try and keep it exciting. Horizon really has a novelty that for me just wasn't very effective the second time. Who knew climbing a giraffe would wear out so fast? But it is undeniably very cool the first time. What could have saved Horizon here is that these towers are sometimes located in the middle of campsites, but as I mentioned before, the level design on this campsite just isn't very good, and with very little ways of approachability, this also becomes very boring very fast. Before I make my final point, I want to compare Horizon to The Witcher 3, because the similarities are undeniable. I could talk about the way conversations with NPCs work, and how it's identical, but that wouldn't be fair. A lot of modern open world games with dialogue choices do this because it's just an easy way of making regular conversations, by doing shot and reverse shot, depending on which character is talking. But what I really want to talk about, you probably already know. And it's the Witcher senses. Obviously they're not called that in the Horizon, but they might as well be. They do exactly the same thing. They analyze an area, allows you to investigate specific elements in a scene, follow tracks, and you're pretty much limited to walking around when in this mode. And my only problem here is the lack of originality. They really made no effort to make this part of the game somewhat unique, and this is something you'll be doing a lot, both in main quests and side quests. But every time I did this, I just felt like I was playing a poor man's Witcher, and that kinda sucks since this is such a big part of the game. The final thing I want to bring up is something that is kinda overdone in modern gaming. In my opinion, this is something in which, had Horizon gone the way of another little game that came out around the same time called Breath of the Wild, where you could have experienced the difficulties of the fights being a lot more dependable on what you bring to the fight rather than your level, would have made it just generally more intense. And it's not like it would have been hard from a design standpoint. Obviously I don't know how hard it would have been from an actual programming point of view, but the game already has loads of clothing that have very minimal effects that could be changed to substitute the health you get from leveling up. The skill points should just be removed. I mean, most of them are things that should have already been unlocked from the beginning, or that could have been unlocked through the story. The others are the usual boring, make thing quicker, make thing faster, make thing more. And the weapons being so elemental bound already would make the transition very easily. But unfortunately, this is where Horizon really loses what could have made it special, because I always felt that the reason I couldn't beat a giant robot was because I was underleveled, and not because I wasn't prepared for the fight. In such an action-heavy game, that is really disappointing. And the systems to make the game that way are already there. Like I mentioned before, weapons are elemental bound. Using those weapons in the right way could be used to remove huge chunks of health of enemies, or very little, depending on your choices, which would incentivize careful and thoughtful play, but alas, the game is too level restrictive. You can try and fight over-leveled enemies using the best strategies, but you'll always be just chipping away at its health. And if you're over-leveled, then there's no reason for thoughtful play, and you can just hack and slash. And for those reasons I just can't find myself to ever love this game. Because it really feels like it could have been something special, but it decided to go the way of fitting within modern game design, which is one of my biggest problems with modern gaming in general, but that's maybe a topic for another video. Please don't take from this that I don't like this game, because I did enjoy my time with it, but we should be critical of things we enjoy, and criticizing doesn't make something bad. And just remember that this is my opinion, so if you enjoyed this video, please help out and subscribe for more videos, maybe even give me a like, maybe even click on the bell icon. And if you didn't like it, then give it a dislike, but please tell me why in the comments and maybe we can have a thoughtful, non-aggressive discussion about it. Be sure to follow me on YouTube by subscribing, be sure to follow me on Twitch, I stream every day. Be sure to follow me on Twitter because I'm very funny. Bye. I don't know. I don't have an outro yet.